And let me talk about 3 especially important ideas for avoiding the smart talk trap. The first one is, although I'm a fan of ignorance in the right situation, I'm not a fan of ignorance in terms of putting people in senior management positions. It actually turns out, and we actually have some quite interesting suggestive quantitative evidence now as well, that it actually turns out that when people understand the work they're managing, rather than having some creative, charismatic CEO comes from another industry, for the most part, it actually pays to have somebody who understands the industry and the way the organization works. And I'll give you 2 examples. One is George Zimmer in the Men's Warehouse. George Zimmer might be sort of almost like a comical figure, and he's the guy who's on television. He says, "I guarantee it." George Zimmer is actually dominating with his Men's Warehouse organizations a declining industry. I mean, hardly anybody buys suits anymore, at least in Silicon Valley. In other places they do, but in Men's Warehouse, it's an organization that's essentially designed to sell people things they don't want to buy and they don't want to be there. And on the backs of that, it's been very successful. And it's no accident that George Zimmer's father was in the clothing business and also invested in his initial business. Another example is Don Peterson at Ford Motor Company. When Don Peterson was brought in, and this was in the late 70s, to Ford Motor Company, they were on the verge of declaring bankruptcy. They were in enormous trouble. And as Don Peterson said, they were so desperate they put somebody in charge who actually knew something about cars. And in fact, there's a story he told my co-author, Jeff Pfeffer. So he was at his first top management team meeting where he was CEO. And after about 90 minutes, he made a comment to the top management team. He pointed out that nobody had used the word car or truck in the first 90 minutes, and maybe that was part of their problem. And in fact, if you look at Ford Motor Company, it's sort of deja vu all over again. They had the same problem again. They brought in this guy, Jacques Nasser, who was distracting him again. They got rid of Jacques Nasser, and now Bill Ford is focusing on cars again. He's a car guy, and they seem to be coming back some. So it's one of those things that's incredibly obvious it doesn't happen. And then there's the question, so what happens if you bring in a CEO or you're brought in as a leader to run an organization that you don't know anything about? Well, a good, interesting case is what Bill George did at Medtronic. Bill George is one of those good to great CEOs in Jim Collins' book, and he brought, I'm sure he didn't do it alone, but he brought Medtronic from a $2 billion to a $60 billion company. If you talk to Bill George, what he'll tell you is the first 9 months he was CEO, since he didn't know anything about the medical device business, he spent 50% of his time watching surgeons put in Medtronic devices, asking them questions, so he actually learned something about the way that the core part of the business works. Second notion is that simple ideas are easier to execute. And Steve Jobs, another very controversial person in Silicon Valley, sort of interesting that when he came back and took over Apple in 1997, this is just a partial list of some of the hardware that was floating around. In fact, when I show it to Apple people who were there, we'll start listing it off. The list is actually about twice as long as this. And plus, there was a huge amount of software that was even worse. And what Jobs did in his usual subtle fashion was within 1 year, since, as the question said, they said customers couldn't figure out the difference between like a Performa 6500 or a 4300. They couldn't even tell their friends which one to buy. Within 1 year, he got rid of everything and went to a simple 2x2, which is laptop, desktop, home office. They've more or less followed ever since. And this is a footnote, but this is also a result of having an organization where there's a bunch of coalitions that have medium power. That was one of the problems at Apple, especially during the Scully days. And to some extent, Gil Amelio, you had a bunch of sort of medium power coalitions so everybody could sort of get part of what they wanted instead of having a whole strategy. And then the last point, we talk a lot about charisma and how important exciting charismatic CEOs are. It isn't just Jim Collins' book. There's other research that suggests that having an exciting charismatic CEO, although helpful at times, at least for short-term gains, is not always all that it's cracked up to be. And I'm going to quote my colleague, Charles O'Reilly. Charles O'Reilly has this argument that smart leaders are exciting. because they're always talking about different ideas. They talk about every new idea they see, they're always exciting because they always have a new idea. But his argument is that wise leaders are boring because they say the same thing over and over and over again until it's done. Jack Welch is somebody who had a lot of ideas I actually don't like, and I could show you empirically were actually probably wrong. But one thing Jack Welch was good about doing was making very clear to his people that we're just going to do a few things and we're do them till they're done. And when Jeff Effer and I were doing research for our book, The Knowing Doing Gap, we interviewed a guy named Jim Bailey, who was head of the quality movement at then Citibank, it's now Citigroup. And Jim Bailey was complaining that the reason they're having so much trouble getting traction in their quality movement was that they weren't focusing enough attention on us. And this comes straight from an interview that we did with him. And you can sort of look at the list that at Citibank at that time, you get certified for, in quality for 5 days of training. At GE, it would take 6 weeks. If you look at some of the rewards and promotion, at General Electric, you did 40% of your compensation was tied to hitting your quality goals, and you didn't get a promotion unless you hit your quality goals. And at Citibank, it was completely unclear about the link. And finally, the thing he was complaining about the most is he couldn't get John Reed and other senior executives to do symbolic things like teaching quality classes to show it mattered, whereas Jack Welch and other senior executives were constantly at Crotonville, their executive ed facility, actually teaching it. And you can, in sort of the lesson here also, as sort of an ending point, if you think about smart talk and smart action, the speed at which smart talk can happen is incredibly fast. I'm a professor. I can like spew out all sorts of management practices. But when you look at the speed at which organizational change, including in a startup, can happen, it's going to happen a lot slower. And I think that was one of the problems that we had during the dot-com boom. During the dot-com boom, the talk and often the misinformation was going at an incredible rate, but the action could only happen so fast. In fact, I was just talking to Mr. Lee about a mutual friend of ours, Jorge Del Calvo, and he's a local lawyer, and Jorge told me this great line during the height of the dot-com boom, which was that his definition of a dot-com CEO was the same as Mark Twain's definition of a gold mine, which is that, if you remember that definition, that it was a gold mine is a hole in the ground with a liar sitting on top of it. And I think we were getting a lot of that sort of smart talk sort of stuff. Anyhow, and we sort of figured out, I think it was the holes in the grounds that didn't have liars sitting on top of them that we're still sort of left with.